The wind was the first and final master of this land. It scoured the plains, stripping topsoil from the earth and paint from the bone-dry clapboard of the house. It was a constant, keening sound, a lament for all that had been lost. For Alara, the sound was a second skin. It had been there the day she'd buried her father beside her mother, and it was there now as she fought to keep the splintered slats of a fence post from giving way completely. Dust coated her tongue, a gritty film that was the permanent taste of her inheritance. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, bleached sky, beating down on the crown of her head until the world shimmered with a feverish haze. This ranch, a map of sweat and sorrow left by her parents, was hers now, and it was dying. Every nail she drove, every pail of water she hauled from the protesting well, was an act of defiance against the inevitable. The bank in Harmony Creek held the note, a tightening noose of numbers and deadlines. The land was all that remained of them, of a life before silence had claimed her. In town they had names for her. When she made the fortnightly trip for flour and salt, the whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. The ghost of Greywater Basin, silent Alara. The children would sometimes run behind her, mimicking a phantom's wail, until their mothers shushed them with sharp glances that held no real reprimand, only a morbid curiosity. She never turned. She never spoke. Her silence was a high wall she had built around her grief, and they mistook it for vacancy, for weakness. They saw a pale, thin girl with eyes that seemed to look through them, and they filled the quiet space she carried with their own cruel narratives. She would stand before Mr. Gable at the mercantile, her list written on a scrap of paper, her coins counted precisely on the worn counter. He would speak slowly, loudly, as if she were deaf or dim-witted. "That'll be $1.12, girl. Can you manage that?" She would only nod, pushing the coins forward, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond his shoulder. The weight of their pity was heavier than any sack of grain. It was a suffocating cloak she could not shrug off. It was on one such day, as the heat rose in waves from the dusty street and the whispers felt particularly sharp, that she first truly noticed him. He was leaning against the assayer's office, a tall, hard-edged shape of a man the sun had baked to the color of worn leather. He was a drifter, one of the nameless men who passed through, looking for work that was as scarce as summer rain. But he was different. His stillness was not idle. It was coiled, and his eyes, deep-set beneath the brim of a battered hat, were not pitying or mocking. They were watching. He saw the boys who jeered from the alleyway, saw Mr. Gable's condescending smile, saw the way Alara's shoulders were held ramrod straight, a solitary pillar against a tide of derision. He saw it all, and his expression never changed. Weeks later, the well roof collapsed. It was a disaster she could not mend alone. The timbers too heavy, the angle too precarious. Desperation was a sharper spur than pride. She rode into Harmony Creek, not on supply day, but on a mission. She found him splitting wood behind the saloon, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady, powerful heartbeat. She dismounted, her throat tight. Words had become foreign objects, awkward and heavy on her tongue. He stopped, axe held mid-swing, and simply waited. She gestured back toward the road, toward her land. She held up 3 fingers, then made a motion of hammering. 3 days' work. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the fraying cuffs of her father's shirt, the fierce set of her jaw. Then he gave a single, curt nod. He did not ask her name. He did not ask for pay in advance. He simply picked up his bedroll, tied it behind his own horse, and followed the silent girl out into the desolate expanse of Greywater Basin. His name, she learned from the single word he grunted when she offered him a ladle of water, was Silas. He worked with a grim, quiet efficiency that mesmerized her. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. His hands, calloused and scarred, understood the language of wood and rope and iron. He did not speak, and for that Alara was profoundly grateful. The silence on the ranch was no longer her solitary burden. It was shared. It settled between them not as an absence, but as a presence. A mutual understanding that the world was loud enough, and work was the only sermon that mattered. She would leave a jar of cool water on a fence post. He would leave a neatly repaired harness hanging on her porch. They were small, unspoken acknowledgments, the foundations of a bridge being built across a chasm of solitude. She watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough, her own hands dusted with flour. He moved with the landscape, as patient and enduring as the rock formations that dotted the horizon. He reshod her aging mare without being asked, his back a solid line of muscle as he worked the forge. One evening, a sudden violent thunderstorm swept across the basin, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that threatened to flatten the meager hay she had painstakingly cut and stacked. The wind tore at the tarp, and she ran out into the deluge, her slight frame no match for the gale. Suddenly, he was there beside her, a solid anchor in the chaos. Together, they wrestled the canvas, fighting the wind's invisible fury, their shoulders brushing, their hands gripping the same ropes. Soaked and shivering, they finally secured it with heavy stones, their shared breath misting in the cold air. In the flickering light of the lantern she held, she saw something in his eyes. Not pity, but a stark, fierce respect. The ranch, which had felt like a vast and lonely grave, now felt like a fortress they were defending together. Her internal world, once a maelstrom of grief and fear, began to quiet. She still missed her father's low chuckle, her mother's humming, but the ache was less sharp. Observing Silas, she remembered her father's words, "Don't listen to a man's proclamations. Watch his hands. They tell the truth of him." Silas's hands told a story of hardship, of competence, of survival. She began to see the world through a different lens. The land was not just a symbol of loss. It was a challenge. The taunts in town were not a judgment on her worth, but a reflection of their own smallness. A subtle shift was occurring within her. The foundations of the wall around her heart were not crumbling. They were turning from brittle brick into solid stone. One morning, she found 2 plump rabbits, skinned and cleaned, hanging by the smokehouse. Later that day, she left a freshly baked loaf of bread and a jar of wild plum jam on the crate that served as his washstand. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The quiet covenant between them had been sealed. The calm was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Jedediah Thorne was a man who fed on the misfortunes of others. He was a vulture in a tailored waistcoat, and he had been circling her property since the day the soil fell on her father's coffin. His initial offers, delivered by a smirking courier from the bank, had been insulting. She had refused them with a single stark no written on the back of his own letters. She had assumed he would move on to weaker prey. She was wrong. Thorne's greed was a patient, corrosive thing, and his patience had finally run out. He arrived on a Tuesday, when the sun was high and hot. He did not come alone. 2 men flanked him, their holstered pistols worn with a casual menace. They were not ranchers. They were enforcers, their eyes as dull and hard as river stones. Silas was in the paddock, mending a gate, the rhythmic rasp of his file a familiar sound against the ever-present wind. Thorne's gaze flickered over him with dismissive contempt before settling on Alara, who stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Girl," Thorne began, his voice a slick ooze of condescension. "We need to have a talk. This foolishness has gone on long enough." He strode forward, his polished boots kicking up clouds of the dust she fought so hard to keep at bay. He stopped at the bottom step, looking up at her. "A place like this, it needs a man's hand. The bank agrees. It's over." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat and slapped them down on the porch railing. "Foreclosure." The word seemed to hang in the air, black and final. One of his men, a lank-haired man with a cruel mouth, unholstered his pistol. He didn't point it, but held it loosely at his side, a clear and brutal punctuation to Thorne's speech. This was the moment. The town's whispers, the pitying stares, the foreclosure notice, the gleaming barrel of the gun. It all converged into a single point of pressure aimed directly at her heart. A tremor went through her, a lifetime of fear and sorrow threatening to break her. But then something else rose in its place. It was a cold, quiet rage. It filled her veins like ice water, steadying her, hardening her. She thought of her mother's garden, her father's worn hands, the shared silence with Silas. This was not just dirt and wood. It was a sanctuary. It was hers. She lifted her chin. Her gaze moved past Thorn, past his smug, triumphant face, and settled on the gunman. She looked directly into his eyes. There was no plea, no terror. There was nothing. Her silence, once her shield of grief, now became her sword. It was absolute, unnerving. She did not flinch. She did not blink. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only her unwavering stare and the gunman's growing discomfort. He shifted his weight, his confidence faltering under the weight of her profound stillness. He had expected tears, hysterics. He was prepared for a woman's fear. He was not prepared for this unnerving, bottomless calm. And then she spoke. Her voice, and used to command, was not loud, but it cut through the oppressive heat with the clean, sharp edge of new steel. It carried the weight of every silent struggle, every lonely night. "This is my land," she said, each word a carefully placed stone. "Get off it." The gunman was so stunned by the sheer, defiant force in her low voice that he took an involuntary step back. That single moment of hesitation was all Silas needed. He had not moved from the paddock, but every line of his body had been coiled, waiting. As the gunman faltered, Silas exploded into motion. He was not a duelist from a storybook. He was a force of pure, practical violence. He crossed the distance from the paddock to the porch in 3 long, silent strides. He didn't reach for a gun. He held the heavy wood rasp he'd been using, its jagged steel edge glinting in the sun. He moved past Thorn as if the man were a ghost, his entire focus on the immediate threat. With a brutal, economic swing, he brought the flat side of the rasp down hard on the gunman's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. The pistol clattered to the dusty ground. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony. Before the second hired man could even draw his weapon, Silas had pivoted, grabbing a heavy wagon yoke that leaned against the porch. He swung it like a club, a sweeping horizontal arc of solid oak that caught the man in the ribs, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing into the dirt. It was over in seconds. It was not heroic. It was swift, efficient, and ugly. Silence fell again, thick and absolute, broken only by the groans of the injured men. Thorn stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. His authority had evaporated. He looked from his broken men to the silent, formidable man standing beside Alara, then back to the girl herself. The ghost he had come to exorcise had become a queen on her throne. Without another word, he scrambled to help his men, half dragging them back to their horses. They fled, leaving a cloud of dust and the foreclosure papers fluttering on the porch rail like a defeated flag. Alara stood, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a wild, triumphant power. She was breathing heavily, feeling the clean, sharp air fill her lungs. She looked at Silas. He was leaning against the post, inspecting a shallow cut on his forearm where the second man's belt buckle had scraped him. Their eyes met, and in that gaze years of conversation took place. Respect, understanding, partnership. She walked down the single step and went to him. Taking the clean rag he was about to use, she gently took his arm and began to clean the wound herself. Her touch was steady. He watched her, his expression unreadable but for the softening around his eyes. "You spoke," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of witness. She finished tying the rag, her fingers lingering for a moment on his skin. She looked up at him, her own eyes clear and certain for the first time in years. "I had to," she replied. Her voice was her own again. The town had seen her silence and called it weakness, a hollow space. They were wrong. It had been a reservoir, deep and still, gathering strength. They had seen a ghost drifting through a dying world, but they were blind to the foundations being laid in the quiet. The ranch was no longer a tomb of memory. It was her kingdom. Later, As the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, they sat on the porch steps. Elara picked up Thorn's papers, tore them neatly in half, and used them to kindle the evening fire in the hearth. The flames caught, eating the words of defeat and turning them into warmth and light. They did not speak of the future. They didn't have to. It was right there, stretching out before them in the vast, quiet landscape, a horizon they would now face together.